Greetings, R. Frederick Riddle here, and we are now in Lesson 8. So let's begin. Our subject is the beginning and setting. The beginning of your novel is absolutely important. How you begin can grab the reader's attention or lose that attention. Here is a principle. Use action words or shock to get the story started. Let me repeat. Use action stories or shock to get the story started. An example of this could be as simple as 10 minutes from now, Jed would be dead. Forget the poetic, the rhyming. That was by accident. That is simply an example. What I want to get, my point is here, that is an example of shock. Right off the bat, the reader is told of something drastic that is to come. Here's an example of action. Joseph struggled as his brothers cast him into the pit. Simple and effective. In my story, The World of Joseph, I used that scene, not that sentence, to start the story. In that case, I was using a scene rather than a sentence. And that is fine if that is what you want to do. So here's the scene. Father has sent me to see how you are doing, Joseph began. But the words were barely out of his mouth, and the brothers grabbed and carried him to the dry well. While the attack was sudden, it wasn't unplanned. His brothers had seen him coming ahead from a long distance and plotted their actions. "What are you doing?" he cried. "This isn't funny. Put me down." "That's a good idea," responded Judah. Holding him by his arms and legs, they carried him over to where there was a pit previously dug by others. Binding him, they lowered the young man down into the pit. Shortly afterwards, Judah was lowered down. He knelt beside Joseph and untied the lad. Then he climbed back up the rope, leaving Joseph in the pit. Once Judah was back on top, Reuben looked down at the teen. "A night in a pit will teach you to be more respectful and keep your dreams to yourself." Laughing, the brothers turned away. Reuben went to a donkey, mounted it, and turned toward Dothan. The rest of them gathered around the fire and began eating. Sitting in the pit, Joseph hung his head. Tears began running down his cheeks. As time slipped by, he began feeling hunger pains, and later chills from the night air. Then came despair as he thought of his dreams. This was not supposed to happen. Now that was more than a sentence. But if you can do it in a sentence, that is great. But you can also expand the idea to a few paragraphs. The point is that you grab the attention of the reader right away. What you read from my book was the entire opening scene. It was after that scene that I went back and told the story that led up to that moment. It can be very effective, but it has dangers as well. I showed you this to demonstrate how that principle can be expanded, but I would encourage you to first learn how to grab attention with the first 2 or 3 sentences. It is a great way to grab attention at the beginning, and then you can go about setting the scene. Now we're into the setting itself. And that brings up another principle. Show, don't tell. I'll repeat it. Show, don't tell. As a writer, the temptation is to write a lot of prose, to tell the reader what the scene looks like and what is going on. In my novel, Perished, I told what was happening. For example, I told God how God created the world, and I described it in beautiful words that put the colors out for them to see. I don't remember if someone told me or I read it, although I think I read it, but the principle of show, don't tell caught my attention. I went back to my book and reworked it so that the reader saw the creation of the Garden of Eden and Adam, but then watched through the eyes of Adam the rest of God's creative acts. Through his eyes, the reader saw God taking what was merely a beginning of the garden and transforming it into something very beautiful. The reader also saw mountains outside the garden, with Adam describing the colors in detail. It made a huge difference. Some novice writers make the mistake of telling everything about the world their character lives in right up front. But it is better if you let the reader learn more about the setting as they travel through the book. Does your story start out grabbing sentences? Grabbing attention? How can you rewrite the beginning to achieve that goal? Experiment and see what you can do. When you find something that you think works, send it to me and have me look it over. Now for the rest of the story. Here is an interesting statement. You can begin a new chapter similar to how you began the book. It's not a principle, but it's an important statement. You can begin a new chapter similar to how you began the book. How is that? The idea is that just as you used action and or shock works to start the book, you can use a similar strategy to start a new chapter, but don't get carried away. Your novel will have many chapters. You don't want to use that principle in all of them, but once in a while it could work. Just remember, you want to keep their attention. Later on in this course, we will be studying scenes, which come in 3 types: beginning, middle, and ending. Just as scenes can be divided into 3 parts, so can the chapters. And once you master that idea, you can move them around. So let's return to the setting for a moment. I mentioned describing the scene, a sort of telling. But though you might not have any people in a scene, doesn't mean that you, the author, have to revert to telling. If the scene is in the desert, or a wilderness, or the city, you can use animals. For example, you could use a stray cat's travel through a neighborhood to acquaint the reader with that setting. But make sure that the cat is more than a stray. It should contribute to the story somehow. I used a cat to help a female slave escape a cruel master and then show her where to hide, albeit a rather small place. It gave the reader an interesting story of her escape and described the back alleys of the city through their travels. Here's another rule for settings. The city, town, village doesn't have to have a real name. Now let me repeat that. The city, the town, the village doesn't have to have a real name. It can be fictional, without a real location. However, while that does work, you need to offer enough information, preferably through the eyes of the animal, that the reader doesn't care about the actual name. I read a story a long time ago about a man who had 2 cats. I don't remember the title or the plot, but I still remember those crime-solving cats. It was intriguing and unique, and left an indelible imprint on me. Oh, and the city was never named. All I knew for sure was it took place somewhere in the Midwest. And it didn't matter to me as a reader. So here's a review. Use action, words, or shock to get your story started. Show, don't tell. Scenes are called beginning, middle, and ending. City, town, or village does not have to be real. Now our next lesson will be on plotting. If you have already started writing and didn't really have a plot, that is fine. You can still make a plot to fit the story. So that's our lesson for today. And I want you to spend some time on this because this requires some thinking, some working things out on your story. You may have to restructure your story a little bit, but that is fine. You have plenty of time. You can go back and redo these things. So this is a good time to go back and look at the beginning and look at your setting and see how, if any of these principles I shared with you today can impact your book. Maybe make it a little bit better. You don't want to make it worse, but you want to make it better. And the better you can make it, going forward, you just have that much more going for you. Hope you enjoyed this lesson. Don't forget to use those tools that are on this page. They're designed for you. They're free. They're part of the course. When you bought the course, you bought the tools. So there's no extra cost for them. And eventually you will build yourself a tool chest. And eventually at the end of this course, you get a much bigger tool chest that you will have access to. I'll see you in the next lesson.